people will definitely be joining us.
Okay.
All right, so hello and good evening, Ruby community. We are now live with our 20th webinar session with Jason Swett, more popularly known as Code with Jason. Now, Jason is one of the most very influential developers in the Ruby community. He's not only just the host of Code with Jason podcast, but also the author of The Complete Guide to Rails Testing. So my name is Sabrina Malik. I'm the community lead at RubyConf Pakistan. I myself am obviously a really huge fan of Jason's content. In fact, it has actually inspired a lot of social media posts that we've been publishing on RubyCon Pakistan social media. So make sure to check out all of Jason's content. I'll be linking all of his website, his blog, and everything else in the description box. So for today's session, Jason will be talking about how we can make testing a habit, and we'll be answering all of your questions regarding Rails testing. So thank you, Jason, for agreeing to be a speaker. It's honestly a huge pleasure to have you here. I would really like for you to say hello to the Ruby community here in Pakistan.
All right. Well, assalamu alaikum. How close did I get, Sabrina?
You got probably 8 or 9 out of 10.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a tough one to say. Anyway, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Same here. So, Jason, one thing I actually wanted to ask you regarding, today's session or today's topic was, so this time we are actually doing something very differently, guys. So one thing is that there are no slides. There is no demo, there is no code. It's just going to be Jason talking about all things Rails testing, how you can become better at testing, how is a test-oriented workflow different from a non-test-oriented workflow, which Jason kind of shared in his teaser video. So why did you want to talk about this, Jason? Like, what intrigued you the most?
Yeah, good question. The reason I want to talk about this is because it's one of the questions that I get asked a lot. There are certain questions that come up for people who are new to automated testing over and over. And I actually put together a list of 8 or 10 questions that people ask a lot. And I've written all about the answers to all those questions. But I wanted to pick just one of those and talk about it today. And this is something that I actually happen to have talked about before. And so, this seemed like a good topic to go over this question of how do I make testing a habit?
Well, that's great because so in the Ruby community, so while I was talking to some of the Ruby and Ruby on Rails developers, they were pretty much intrigued regarding the testing format, especially so in your book, The Complete Guide to Rails Testing. So I really liked how you had kind of segmented that, what kind of testing frameworks should you be using, what level of test coverage you'll be needing. So, all of these things, they seem really important. And as well, it seemed really organized. So again, hosting this webinar session, of course, makes sense and kind of goes in line with the whole, Rails testing. What is the best thing to do? What is the best strategy to go with? And especially the one question that, you had really addressed in that section as well was, should we always be using test-driven development? Something that kind of, piques interest of a lot of people. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, please continue.
All right. Well, shall I get started?
Yeah. So one thing, guys, we will be answering all of your questions side by side to Jason's lecture. So feel free to ask any questions you want. We'll be answering them in parallel to Jason's talk. So I'm going to be here. I will just raise my hand and let Jason know whatever question it is. So please do list all of your questions in the live stream chat. So Muhammad Zara is saying, Walaikum assalam, Jason. So he's saying hi back.
All right. Well, hi.
All right. So over to you, Jason.
Okay. So once again, I'm talking about how to make testing a habit. And there's kind of 3 points that I'm going to cover. And I'll be looking over at my notes on the other monitor as I talk, in case you wonder why I'm looking over this way. But I'm going to touch on how a test-oriented workflow is different from a non-test-oriented workflow, as you said, Sabrina. And then what are the forces that stop people from developing a habit of writing tests? Because I think a lot of times when we try to develop new habits, there are things that are blockers that prevent us from developing those habits. So we're going to talk about what those are. And then I'm going to talk about some beliefs and practices that you can adopt in order to help make testing a habit. Because I think there are some like mindset shifts, which if you make, it makes the shift to having a test-oriented workflow easier. Okay, so the first topic, how a test-oriented workflow is different from a non-test-oriented workflow. So I want to talk really briefly about this experience I had recently. I did a round of job interviews. I was interviewing people to work where I work. There were like 25 interviews, and out of those 25 people, I gave everybody a brief coding exercise. And most of the 25 people, maybe all but 3 or 4 of them, completely failed the exercise. And everybody who failed in the same way, which I thought was really interesting. And everybody who succeeded in the same way. And it was interesting to me to observe that like stark difference. But the way that they failed was actually something that I've seen a lot of times before over the years, going back even to the very first computer science class I took in college, which is the people who failed, they would try to write their entire program all at once before they ever attempted to run it. And then they would run it, 10, 15 minutes in, and they would get some mysterious error. And now in order to find out what's wrong, you have to dig through all this stuff because you've written so much. And that's no way to go. And the people who succeeded took a completely different approach. Instead of writing all the code and then trying to run it at the end, they would write just one line and then they would try to run it. And they would check to see if the result they got from running that matched what they expected or not. If it matched, then fine, they could go on and write another line and continue the cycle. And if it didn't match, then they knew they had to make some correction. And because they had only written one line, it wasn't a big mystery where the problem lay. It was obviously something to do with that one line they added. And so seeing that it made a light bulb go off for me. And so I ended up writing a blog post about that. And I call it the feedback loop method, where again, before you write any code, you come up with an idea of like, okay, what do I want to achieve? And what do I expect to happen when I add this one line of code? And then you say, okay, I'm gonna basically what you're doing is you're thinking of a manual test that you can perform to tell you whether your code worked or not. And so if you go through that process I described just now, which again I call the feedback loop method of programming, that's actually the same thing as TDD. It's just manual TDD. And that was a really important thing for me to realize, because I think a lot of people find test-driven development very unnatural, and they find the idea of writing the test first very unnatural. But when I think back to my own way of coding from years ago before I started testing, I would code in this feedback loop method where I would conceive of a manual test before I wrote the code. Like, okay, I want to build some certain form or something like that. I expect that if I hit submit on the form, then I'm going to get an email. So I would like form that expectation in my head. And that's the equivalent of like writing an automated test, except of course, I'm not writing an automated test. I'm just conceiving of a manual test. So I would conceive of that manual test, then write the code, then perform some steps. And so I think that's a super useful thing for people to realize potentially, because what we're talking about is like a completely different way of working. And it actually doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with testing in the beginning, because it's like this bad workflow that a lot of developers follow, where they write a huge chunk of code before they ever try to run anything, is much different from this feedback loop method of writing code. And so I think before somebody tries to get into test-driven development, you have to make that mindset shift from the idea of writing a huge chunk of code and then running it to this feedback loop method. Okay, so that's what I wanted to preface all this with regarding how a test-oriented workflow is different from a non-test-oriented workflow. Now I want to talk about what are some of the forces that stop people from developing a habit of writing tests. There's kind of two things. One is just plain lack of skills and knowledge. If you don't know how to write tests, you're not going to be able to develop a habit of writing tests. And the answer to that is just you have to learn all the ins and outs of writing tests. There's not really any way around it. So that's straightforward, but not easy. And then the other thing is a little more interesting, which is trying to think of too much at once. And I'll expand on that a little bit, because this is something that I haven't really heard other people talk about very much. But once I made the realization for myself, it made things a lot easier for me. If you're somebody who writes tests, or somebody who at least tries to write tests, you've probably had the experience of thinking, I should write a test for this, but you don't really know how the test should go. And you feel this like resistance because you're like, I should write a test, but that seems kind of painful. And like, you're not sure how it should go. You get this kind of writer's block for writing your test. And I think it helps to realize all the different layers that go into a test. So there are, what should the test do from a big picture perspective? And then just little things like, what should the test file be called? How should I label each part of the test? What's the exact syntax to achieve what I want? Like, okay, I have to click on this radio button. All right, what's the capybara syntax again for clicking on a radio button? Just all those little things. And if you're not thinking individually, separately about all those things, it can create that mental block where all you're thinking is, I don't know how to write this test. So something that can be done to make all that way easier is to just separate all those things. So first, here's how I like to do it. And I even do this still like a good proportion of the time, because it's not always clear to me what all these things should be, all these elements I just mentioned. It's not always clear to me. And so I'll like open up a test file, or sometimes even just a note in a note-taking program or something like that. And I'll just list out in English what steps I need to take. So let's go with this form example again. Maybe the first step is I need to visit the URL where the form lives. Second step, fill in the first name field. Third step, fill in the last name field. Next step, click the submit button. And then finally, I expect that the subsequent page has the text, thank you, or something like that. So I can write all that out in English without having to think about any code or anything like that. And just that job, that's actually like not always all that easy. Sometimes that's actually pretty hard. And so like, don't try to do that and all this syntactical stuff at the same time, especially if you're just learning testing. Like, how hard must that be? Like, not only do you have to come up with what the test does, but you have to do all kinds of research on how to make it happen. Like, that's way too much to think about at once. So again, figure out what you want your test to do before you figure out how to make your test do it. So from there, I'll proceed like this. Writing tests is so hard, at least it can be really hard, that I feel like my brain goes into this different, like more stupid mode, and I have to do certain things to make things easier for myself. And so I'll often ask myself the question, what's the very next step? because like I'll get lost and stuck and stuff like that, just like everybody. So I'll have I'll start from the very beginning. Let's say I just took some notes saying what this test should do. I'll say, okay, well, this test has to live somewhere. So I'll think of a file where it should go. I'll come up with the file name. I'll come up with the place it should go in the directory structure. And something I think is important to take note of is like, you don't have to worry about getting it right on the first try. Whatever you name the file, you can always rename it later. So I don't super worry about getting that right on the first pass. Anyway, that's the first step. I'll come up with the file name. Then once I open the file, I'll know, okay, I have to have like that little bit of boilerplate that every test has to have. So I'll just go to some other test and copy the frozen string literal true rspec.describe, that shell that we have to have, because we know we're going to have that no matter what. Then there's the description that the test has to have. And when it comes to these descriptions, I really don't worry about getting it right, to the point where I might put in the description, it does stuff. Like I'll literally just type the words, it does stuff, because I know it can come, it's going to be so much easier once I've written the test to come back and put a label on it than to try to think of what the label should be before I write the test. So I just put some placeholder text in there before I start. All right. And then some people, and I've seen like advocates of test-driven development do this before, they'll like come up with all the test cases before they write anything. Sometimes I do that because in some situations, maybe it makes sense, but the vast majority of cases, that's too much to think about, at least for me. And so I'll just come up with one single test case. And I don't worry about anything beyond that, because my whole philosophy is to make life easy on myself. Looks like we have a question. Oh, Sabrina, you're muted.
So thank you. So while you were talking about, like how, like what sequence to go for when writing tests. So Jaffer Lone, he is asking a question. Hi, Jason, do you believe that code should be written in an incremental way and tested right away so as to make the automation reliable from the get-go?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, consider the alternative. Like, again, it goes back to that idea of writing a whole bunch of stuff and then running it at the end. That's hard. And then if I've heard people before have the idea that you can write a complete feature or even like a complete product and then go back and add tests at the end. And to me, that's just like a totally crazy idea, because then at the end, the advantage of writing a test, then writing the code to make it pass and continuing that loop, the advantage to that is that everything's covered. Now, not to digress too much, but some advocates of TDD say that you should never write any code without first having a failing test. I don't code quite like that, although close, but not quite like that. But the advantage of that is, and I say this as an illustration, the advantage of that is that that every single line of code in your program is covered by a test. And that's really valuable. And like I said, I'm not that strict with my test writing.
Right.
But I do write tests for most of my code. And because I'm doing it as I go, I know that the vast majority of my code in my code base is covered by tests. Whereas if you try to go back and add them later, you don't get that same confidence.
All right, got it. So while we were talking, you were talking about, test-driven development. So Daud Sadek, he is asking for your opinion, and that is BDD versus TDD. So
BDD versus TDD?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have much of an opinion on this. BDD is a term that I come across once in a while, and I've tried several times to understand the difference between BDD and TDD. And maybe if I thought really hard, I could remember the difference. but it's just not a question that I find terribly relevant to my work. And so that's a question that I've just pretty much ignored. So that's my candid answer to that.
Right, right. Well, makes sense, honestly. Again, depending upon, your workflow, if it's something that really doesn't, bother, like you're not really bothered about the verses and, battle of the boats. So, makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let me see where I was. I was talking about okay, I'll very quickly recap. So write out the steps of the test, create the file, put a placeholder description. Oh, yeah, and here's what I'll often do next. I will take that high level description of what I want the test to do, and I will insert that as comments inside the test file. And it might even seem silly, like all these tiny steps that I do, because it might seem like a lot of overhead, but it's not a lot of overhead. And it really makes things a lot easier, and it makes the test writing process formulaic. So that I don't have to stop and think about what to do. It's just like a process that I follow, that I can follow the process rather than doing it all in my head each time. Anyway, I'll add all these comments, and then I'll replace the comments one by one with the syntax to make the test actually work. And now here's a really important thing: that feedback loop method I talked about earlier. I even follow that feedback loop method when I'm writing tests. So when I have my list of comments and I convert the first comment to actual working syntax, I'll run my test, even though I know my test doesn't do anything useful yet, just to make sure that I didn't make any mistakes in that first line. And then I'll take the next line, convert that to working syntax, run that just to make sure everything still works as I expect. And I'll just go through until I have the whole thing. And then I'm good. I'll go back and I'll take my placeholder descriptions and I will replace them with real descriptions, which again is much easier after the fact than before. And then I'll commit and push and wait for CI to tell me if anything else broke. And that's kind of the cycle.
So while we're on that note, Muhammad Hamza does have a question. Hi, Hamza, how are you? So he is asking, let's say if we got a huge code base with 0% coverage, what should be the approach to start writing tests now? Where should we start? So I guess that is actually something very tricky. Like, where do you even start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we could spend like the whole rest of this call just discussing that, because there's actually a lot to that. And this is even one of the other questions that I've written about before, because it comes up so much. So a couple things I'll say about that. One is it depends hugely on what the scenario is. Like, okay, there's this big project and it has 0% test coverage. There are reasons why it came into existence that way, like it may be that it was written by people who don't have any experience writing tests, or they don't believe in tests, or something like that. And so that can create a tricky situation. If you're working on a team of people who don't find value in tests, then I think it's honestly pretty much futile to try to get them to it's futile to try to convert them into the type of people who are going to value tests. It's just probably not going to work. So that's something to consider. And then, okay, so another possibility is that the people who wrote it, they don't have experience with testing, but they're not proud of it. They consider that a deficit in their skills, and they want to write tests. They just don't know how. And so that's a different story. And there's, of course, more hope there. But it has to be done in a certain way. So one super common piece of advice that I think is actually terrible advice is that all new code should get a test. And that's just like the rule. At some point in time, you say that all new code gets a test. And that's how you do it. But that's like crazy because first of all, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be, maybe not huge, but there's like a not small amount of work that needs to be done before your first test can be written. Like you have to decide what test framework you're going to use and all these other tools and stuff like that. And then it's almost certainly the case that the code was written in such a way that's not particularly easy to test. And so that's an issue that's going to be addressed before you can even write your first test. And then there's all kinds of stuff like, all code bases that have good test coverage, they have all these like factories and stuff like that that exist to support the test. And you're not going to have any of that stuff in the beginning. So like the idea that you can just pick a point in time and then everything after that has tests is not particularly realistic. And I'll add one more reason why that's not realistic is because you might have like a feature that takes 5 minutes, but then to write that test takes like 8 hours worth of work just because that infrastructure to support that isn't there. And that's going to be really hard for people to justify. So here's what I would suggest instead. Start with what's easiest. So if you have, another piece of advice that's very common, but I think steers people in the wrong direction is test what's most valuable first. Well, the stuff that's most valuable is probably also going to be the most complex and hard to test because there's so much going on there. So I say don't start with what's most valuable, start with what's easiest. So if there's some peripheral page that hardly does anything and it might feel pointless to write the test because all you're doing is maybe you're visiting a page and submitting a form and that's it. It feels like you've hardly accomplished anything. Well, then you at least have a beachhead because it's forced you to do all these things like pick a test framework and get all that infrastructure in place. And so the difference between having 0 tests and having 1 test is actually huge. And then once you have that test in place, add tests to areas that are more and more difficult and gradually work your way to testing that stuff that's the most valuable. One more thing I'll say about that, which maybe relates to what I'm talking about now, is again, the skills and habits might not be present on the team. And so I think in order to turn things around and start adding tests, something needs to happen with the development workflow so that adding tests is a part of people's, people need to habitually add tests as part of their development work. So that's what I'd say about that.
All right. Well, we have another question. So the question is from Mohsen Jamshed. He is a longtime follower of RubyCon Pakistan. Hi, Mohsen. So I'm not really sure of the context. Mohsen, if you can elaborate, that would make more sense. So he is asking, what is your suggestion on the scenario where people want to write code but don't know how?
Maybe he meant where people want to write tests but don't know how. Okay, I'll address that. So that, I'll say something about that, which kind of ties into the question we just had about adding tests to an existing application. Because that's another scenario. Like, let's say I've worked on a project for a year and I've built it with no tests because I just don't know how. Well, retroactively adding tests to an existing project is like a distinct skill of its own. And like, even for me, somebody who's like really experienced with testing and with Rails, it's super hard for me to go and retroactively add tests to an existing Rails project. So for somebody who's trying to learn tests and add tests to an existing Rails project, like that's super hard. Like I say, don't even try that as your first foray into testing. That's just like way too hard. What I would suggest instead is to go and do your own side project where everything's clean and just teach yourself testing in this like sandbox project. And what will probably happen, because this has been my experience, is you'll code in your sandbox project and you'll gain a certain level of confidence. And then you'll say, oh, I see, like that's what factory bot is. Okay, got it now. And you can go back to your production project and make a little bit of progress there. But then you might get stuck again. And so then you can go back to your sandbox project, gain a little more experience and say, oh, okay, I get it. Like that's what I need to do. And then go back to your production project and go back and forth between the two. But I'm not exactly addressing the question of like, if you don't know how to write tests and you want to start, how do you do that? That's obviously a very broad question and a very broad answer, but I'll try to give an answer concisely. There are tools you need to learn, and there are principles that you need to learn. And like we've been talking about, there are habits you need to develop. So in the Rails world, you need to learn a test framework, and then probably factory bot if you're using factories, which most people do, capybara, and a couple other things. And something that's foundational to some of these is just a certain level of knowledge of Ruby, specifically Ruby DSLs, because these libraries like factory bot and RSpec specifically make heavy use of DSLs. So I would suggest taking some time and learning those tools. I'll just pick RSpec because that's the most common. So RSpec, factory bot, and capybara, those are kind of the main tools that are good to learn. And then as far as types of tests, because that's another question I get asked by beginners a lot, I make heavy use of model specs and system specs. The other types of tests I do use, but those two are the ones I use most heavily, and those are the ones that I would suggest starting with. And out of those two, model specs and system specs, I would suggest starting with system specs because those are like, that's the smallest leap to make from manual testing to automated testing. We talked before about that form example where you visit a page for a form and then submit it. That's relatively easy to say, okay, I can imagine how I would do a manual test for this. Now let me convert that to a system spec. That's not a huge conceptual leap. Model specs are a little bit more tricky for people because the question is, okay, what exactly do I test on this model? It's not always all that clear for people. So I suggest starting with system specs. So there's a lot more I could say about how to learn testing, of course, because learning testing is like almost as hard as learning programming itself, and it takes years. But hopefully that's a good enough start for now.
Absolutely. So while we were having like this discussion of like where to start, like how to start and everything like that, and for people who don't know how to write tests and all, so it kind of like reminded me of your blog post about the best programming and debugging tips, and in that you actually covered the fact that well, for one, I 100% agree with the fact that you should be initiating the testing process with something that's very easy and beginner friendly, rather than, like you said, something very complex, or something that's, of course, if it's valuable, it's complex, like you said. So, but in that specific portion, you did say that, work in increments. So that was something that, really appealed to me, that, tests, basically it's like test after every feature change. So like test after every change. So it makes sense, for you to practice writing tests for every feature, for every update in a sandbox. So I think that's, a really good it's a really good starting point for someone who wants to practice more on writing tests, I think.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me remember where I was in the in my talk here. Yeah, I guess one other comment that I want to make about this whole process of making life easy on yourself when you're writing a test. Don't think about everything at once. Try to separate these different jobs that you have to do. I often think about mental RAM and mental disk. And so RAM is like my short-term memory. And the more that I have to hold in my short-term memory, the harder of a time I'm going to have. And so I try to get these things out of my mental RAM and metaphorically write them to disk, like where I had the idea of conceiving of what the test needs to do and then writing it down in some sort of note that gets it out of my mental RAM and onto disk. So my mental RAM is free to think about other stuff. Okay. And then the last thing I'll say about things that block people from developing the habit of writing tests is a belief that testing is something extra. Like I've heard funny anecdotes before, like somebody will quote a project to a client and the client will say, whoa, that's a lot. How much will it be if we skip tests? How much less? And it's like, no, it won't be less if we skip tests. It'll cost more if we skip tests because it'll take way longer. Tests aren't a time adder. Tests are a time saver. And so I think making that realization is a prerequisite to developing the habit of writing tests, or maybe not a prerequisite, but at least it's very helpful, I find, because it's helpful to remember that this isn't an extra thing that's costing me extra time. This is a time saver. All right, so here are some of the beliefs and practices you can adopt in order to make testing a habit. So maybe some of you have heard about Larry Wall's 3 virtues, the laziness, impatience, and hubris thing. I have 3 virtues for testing, which is almost the same thing, but slightly different, which is laziness, fear, and pride. So I'll talk about each one of these in turn. Laziness. I write tests. It's funny. Some people, they sometimes accuse me of having discipline because I write tests. They're like, oh, you write tests. You must be so disciplined. It's like, no, I don't write tests because I'm disciplined. I write tests because I'm lazy. Again, tests are a time saver, not a time adder. Think about the alternative to writing tests. The alternative to writing automated tests is that you just do all your testing manually. I've lived that life and it's terrible. I don't want to do that. I don't want to make a tiny change and then manually run a huge set of regression tests and like have to do all this clicking and typing and stuff. Like that sounds like torture. I don't want to do that. So automated testing is way easier than that. Or if I don't want to do all this manual testing and I don't want to write automated tests, I can just live with the consequences of not having any testing at all. And that's terrible too. And I've lived that life before also, where you just write some code, click around a little bit, decide it works, then push it to production and something horrible breaks. Like that's really bad too. I don't want that. And so my laziness drives me to write tests. Fear. This kind of ties into that idea of you don't write tests, you push it to production, something breaks. That's really bad. I don't like that feeling of getting in trouble for doing something bad. It's embarrassing to release bugs and stuff like that. And so a fear drives me to write tests. And then lastly, pride. Like if I put out a pull request and one of my coworkers sees it and they see that I didn't write tests, that's a little bit embarrassing. I don't want to be seen as the kind of person who doesn't write tests. And then I also want to set a good example for other people. Maybe I work with other people who are more junior. I want to set a good example for them. And so I want my PRs to be exemplary, or all my code in the code base to be exemplary, so that they can see my code and say, okay, this is how we do things around here. So I don't want to push something that has no tests or insufficient test coverage or whatever and have them see that. It's pride that drives me to write tests. So to kind of wrap everything up, there's maybe kind of a mindset shift. I would guess that some of you watching, maybe you thought that writing tests is something, in order to develop this habit, you need to like add more discipline or something like that. But it's not a discipline thing, at least not for me. It was about these mindset shifts. So I'll real quick recap these mindset shifts that I've talked about. First, remember the feedback loop method of programming. And this is something that's kind of independent of automated testing. It's just the idea of thinking of a test, which can be an automated test or a manual test, writing a piece of code that you think that will meet the needs of that test, then run that test and repeat that workflow. That's a different way of programming from how a lot of people do it. And I think once somebody shifts to that way of thinking, then that really prepares them for automated testing. And then something that can remove friction is like when you go to write tests, there's a lot of stuff to think about. And so if you can separate all those things, and when you're having a hard time writing a test, consciously think, what is it that's making this hard? What are the different things that I have to do to make this test happen? Think about them individually. That can remove a lot of the friction and make writing tests easier. And then lastly, this laziness, fear, and pride thing, just remember the alternatives to automated testing and how much worse those alternatives are, how much more time consuming and tedious those alternatives are. And maybe you, like me, will be driven to writing automated tests because you actually realize it's the path of least resistance. And that is how I make testing a habit.
All right. Well, yes, absolutely. I think, once you think about the, it could be worse. And, like the worst alternatives, that's probably when you realize that, okay, no, we really do. And I don't know, like I'm not sure of what kind of mindset would people have to, like avoid testing. I mean, what is it exactly? Is it like writing tests that is like, that's so, I don't know, fearful that people kind of like refrain from doing it altogether? I don't think that's a way that you should be going. And so while we're on that note, we do have like a question. Just all right, sorry. So I just had my puppy interrupt me.
No problem.
That's so funny. Anyhow, so we had a question on that note from Arsan Malik. So his question is more regarding the environment the environment related to testing. So his question is that how should we incorporate automated testing in CI/CD with respect to deployments on different environments? Should we add unit tests on development and performance testing on QA? And what should be the path? And then I'll come on to the second part of the question.
I think I have to plead ignorance on that one. That's something that I just don't know the answer to.
All right. So this two-part question. So the second part is also, what code coverage tool is compatible with Ruby? Will JUnit work? So that's a two-part question.
Good question. So I have all kinds of thoughts about test coverage, which I'll share because I think it's really important and it's a really common question. I don't even remember what I use because it's been so long since I've checked. Oh yeah, I remember what I use. I use SimpleCov. It's been a really long time since I've checked, and here's why. People often ask, what level of test coverage should I shoot for? Is 80% good? Does it have to be 100%? Whatever. And I think this is like totally the wrong way to look at it. Because what does it mean if you have like 80% or 90% or whatever? Like, what does that mean? It doesn't actually mean anything. What actually matters is what it's like to work on your code base. Like, why do we write tests in the first place? We write tests for higher productivity because you can ship more stuff in less time with tests than without tests. We write tests for fewer bugs. And, some of the great advantages that you get if you have good test coverage is you can deploy frequently. Like where I work, we deploy multiple times a day, which is great. Some places I've worked before, you only deploy like once a month or something like that. And those deployments are really scary because the changes are so big. And because the changes are so big, there's a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong, and things usually do go wrong. And that's all terrible. And so instead of asking what level of test coverage do we have, I think it's a better question to ask, like, how is all this feeling? Like, are we experiencing the types of problems that result from too little test coverage, or are we not? Because if you're just doing fine in all these areas, like you're able to deploy multiple times a day and you don't have big production bugs and stuff like that, then like you're good. Like you don't need to ask what your test coverage is because you're just good. And if you're having the opposite situation where you can't get deployments out, when you do, it's really risky. A lot of things go wrong and stuff like that. You don't need to ask what your test coverage level is in order to tell that you need more tests. Like it's blindingly obvious that you do need more tests. Having said that, last time I checked my test coverage, it was like 96 point something percent. So I do tend to have pretty high test coverage as a result of these habits that I've talked about. But I don't think it's a productive number to know about. I think these other questions are more useful.
All right. Well, again, 100% agreed. I think it's tricky. Like, I think it's really tricky, honestly, to say that, you like everybody, like every single person for every single project, they need to have 100% test coverage. I would not feel comfortable, saying that statement.
Yeah, agreed.
So, yeah, moving on, I don't think we have any further questions as of now. Guys, if you do have further questions, please do put them in the live stream chat, because after that we will be moving towards the conclusion of the webinar. So while we were talking about frameworks and tools. So Arslan Malik did have a question, which I think you did address, but again, if you want to recap, which tools are best, or which one would you recommend the most for doing testing? Like what would be your number one tool, your go-to tool?
Good question. So I kind of feel compelled to mention that there are like two camps. There's like the mini test people and the RSpec people.
Yeah.
So the way I think about this question is, it kind of is a moot point a little bit, because people ask, should I do mini test or RSpec? Well, usually somebody else decides for you. You get a job somewhere and either they use mini test or they use RSpec. And so you don't have a choice. You just have to use what they use. And then let's say you choose mini test because you happen to like it better, and then you're in a job interview. Nobody's going to say, oh, you're really experienced with testing, but only in mini test, not RSpec. Sorry, we want an RSpec person. Like,
Right.
That's never going to happen. Like testing principles are universal, and it doesn't depend on the framework. So you really can't go wrong. I use RSpec just because like that's what everybody uses. Not because I necessarily think it's technically superior to mini test or anything like that. But just to recap, I guess, along with RSpec usually comes FactoryBot and Capybara. And it's not really a matter of like recommending tools, because it's just kind of a package thing. Like everybody uses RSpec, Capybara, and FactoryBot. There are exceptions, but they're few and far between. And so I guess just for the likelihood that you'll come across, like those are the safest bets. Learning those ones are the safest bets, because when you get a job, it's likely that those will be the ones that they're using.
Right. Well, thank you so much for answering that. I do see that, we are about to hit our 1 hour mark. So guys, we are actually on a bit of a time crunch. So make sure to put in your questions in the live stream, because we are going to end like in a couple of minutes. So probably the last question for today. But Abdul Rahman, he is asking, my question is, what should what we should skip while writing test case, like not write for all possible cases and only test main cases?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is something else I've written about. When do I not write tests? Because this is another common question. And I'm probably not going to be able to recall the exact criteria, but there's a list of like 3 or 4 criteria where if the answer to every single one of those is yes, then I skip the test. And the questions are things like, if this feature breaks, will the consequences be low? Like if there's something, obviously, like if there's like a purchase button and it doesn't work, the consequences are very high. But if there is like some indicator and it's supposed to turn red or green, and if it doesn't work right, nobody actually cares and people can do their job anyway, the consequences are very low. So I ask, are the consequences low of failure? Is the test expensive to write? Because combine those two together. If the test is going to take me 3 hours to write somehow, and the consequences of failure are really low, then that doesn't really seem justified. And those are the only ones I remember right now, but you can probably kind of see my thought process. I do kind of a cost benefit analysis, but I will say that those are rare cases. Maybe 1 to 5 out of 100 times it'll be a case where I skip the test, but it's not nothing. And I think it's useful to know when you would not write a test, because if people write tests for every single thing and they don't apply any critical thinking to it, then that's just dogma. It's religion as opposed to engineering. And so I think it's useful to know the answer to that question of when you would not write a test. And for me, those are at least 2 of the criteria: when the consequences of failure are low and the test is expensive to write.
Right. Well, that brings me to the point that, when people say that, like you said, you mentioned that, oh, you write tests, so you must be very disciplinary. I think disciplinary would be that, you're writing tests for every single thing that you don't necessarily need to write tests for. That would be something extremely disciplinary.
Yeah, I'd say so.
All right. Well, actually, we do have a question. So probably the final question for today. Again, it's another question from Mohsin. Can we have a session in which you actually can demonstrate about starting with test cases? Well,
Absolutely.
I'm sure we'll have Jason over again, and like where he can kind of like demonstrate.
Yeah, definitely. And I have plans to do certain things like that in the future. And I love it when people ask me questions like that and make requests like that, because I don't always know. There's a million different directions I could go because there's so much to testing, but I don't always know what people are most interested in. So I love questions like that. I'm certainly up for it. And by the way, I do have some videos on YouTube. If you just search for like Jason Swett YouTube, you can find some of those videos. I'm in the process right now of putting together some videos on various testing topics. I'm starting at the very beginning, which is some Ruby DSL stuff right now, because that I find helps with understanding RSpec and capybara and all those things. But yes, if this is up to Sabrina too, if we want to have me back sometime, but I'd be happy on my end to do a presentation where we do write some code.
That would be really, really great. I think on that note, we should move towards the conclusion, because Jason has somewhere to be, and we don't want to take too much time of his, because we want him to come for another session. So, right. Thank you, Jason. That was really, honestly, that was something very not just value adding, but it kind of like gives us developers a sense of direction in terms of testing, that okay, the starting point, the tips to keep in mind, and your 3 your three core rules that you follow. So I think all of these, combined, they gave us something very value adding to the community. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And is it okay if I share some places where people can learn more?
Absolutely, absolutely. You can share the links as well, and we'll add them into the description box. So that would be great as well.
Okay, great. One is the list that I've compiled of answers to common testing questions. That can be found at railstestingguide.com. And Sabrina, I'll send you the links to all these things.
Perfect.
And that's a free resource at railstestingguide.com. And then I've written a whole bunch of blog posts on Rails testing and just testing in general and other Rails stuff that's not testing at codewithjason.com. And then, of course, I host the Code with Jason podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.
Another comment from GS Shahid. He is saying, thank you, Jason. Your approach is very practical. Well, I would definitely agree with him as well.
Oh, well, thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in for our live stream. Like you said, do let us know, what do you prefer? Like, do you guys prefer slides, demos, code samples, whatever it is? Do let us know. Also, it would be great if you want to know. So if you want to share more like topics of whatever interests you, that also gives us, RubyCon Pakistan team, a really good sense of direction of what to have next. So a big thank you to Jason Swett for coming and taking out the time. It was so amazing having you, Jason. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, all right. See you guys. I hope all of you have a really good weekend and enjoy. So we'll just end. Thank you so much.